Well, thank you, Tom. You're always asking too much, but I also want to thank the Prado for getting this workshop together, because those scholars that are gathering here are another kind of Raphael workshop, relying on the Prado workshop, which has been terribly kind in organizing this trip. Also, the many people behind the screens, whatever fuss, crazy fuss we create, they make us feel very comfortable here. And never lose their patience with us. So thank you very much for all of this. And thank you also for David Franklin for his talk, because I think he's provided a perfect example of methodology. Although we are friends, although we are in the same town for a couple of days, although we're even attending the same event, we haven't even spoken here. We exchanged ideas in Rome a couple of weeks ago. So whatever we say about the Raphael workshop, we don't have to take anything for granted. And I think that was a perfect example of what we're trying to do here. There is probably one thing we can be certain about as far as the Raphael workshop goes, and this is that it started precisely in the far corner of that room I'm showing you on the right, the library of Pope Julius II, nowadays called the Stanza della Segnatura, and on the adjacent window embrasure, of which also I'm showing you an image on the right of the screen. I do not refer here to the decorative parts, to the framing moldings, to the grotesque, and whatever is around this. I'm referring to the big figurative compositions in this part of the room. There is the handing over of the pandects, which probably was painted based on Raphael drawings by Lorenzo Lotto, and there is the legend of the two swords. If you look at the architectural background, if you look at the physiognomy of the figures, you may wonder whether that is a piece that was created by Baldassare Peruzzi. Whatever caused Raphael to rely on collaborators like that, we do not know. It may have been the speed with which he was asked to finish the work in the stanza. It may have been the curiosity in different kinds of painting. Lorenzo Lotto came from a completely different cultural and technical background as far as his painting was concerned. He may have been forced by the patron, because Lorenzo Lotto had been paid a certain amount of money and never done anything for it. So the Pope or one of his administrators may have thought he might as well give him a hand in this fresco. This start of the Raphael workshop, still in the Stanza della Segnatura, where Raphael became Raphael according to Vasari through his school of Athens, and where he started what in the late Raphael is the hallmark Raphael. That does not mean that he continued always to employ his collaborators in everything he did. So if the moment he moves on to the next fresco, the Mass of Bolsena in the next room, it's an entirely autograph picture done with an enormous speed, done in a very short time. There are just over 30 giornate, and just look at these very intense individual portraits of these chair bearers, who are people will probably never remember their name. The name was probably forgotten soon after they'd been portrayed here. But the intensity that Raphael puts into something like this, or into this very small detail, just note the different textile structures in that very small detail of a few square centimeters that I'm showing you here. And probably you should also bear in mind that protom of the lion's head when you look at the Dona Isabel here in the exhibition. So there are these very intense details which make this an entirely autograph fresco. Also the very beautiful woman surrounded by the children on the left, which is not an individual portrait but an idealized portrait, or the very experimental approach that Raphael can have with the flames of these candles moved by the air, where he tries out using this glazing, which is something that he was very fond of since the Disputa, and then is celebrated so enormously in the liberation of St. Peter's. Now, these extraordinary candles and these details you find in a drawing like this, with the reflection of on the paneling, where you almost see the reflection of the light moving in this. All of this is autographed. But if we move on to the next fresco in the room, the Expulsion of Hylia Doris, it is, of course, a much more complex composition with the architectural background, with many more figures, with the patron still requiring changes while Raphael is doing that. The whole group with the Pope and the chair bearers was inserted after the fresco had been completed. So that means that he is calling again for help. And I'm just showing you these two extremes of the fresco, where it becomes immediately obvious, this very superficial painting on the left and this strong modeling on the right, where it becomes immediately clear that there are different people working on this fresco at the time, and how mechanical these things can be, maybe illustrated by that arm of the kneeling woman, that precursor of the famous figure in the Transfiguration that you have in front of the papal chair of the Pope, where a giornate just runs along that red ribbon. And if you compare the folds around the elbow, and if you look how rough the folds are painted in the lower part of the arm, you can immediately get an impression of how Raphael approached this painting with his collaborators. Now, again, the Liberation of St. Peter's is going to be an entirely autograph fresco painted in 28 giornate. And when it comes to the Leon Attila, the last fresco in the room that we are restoring right now, so that is still a slide taken before the restoration, we have a composition with many figures, which again, it is not entirely autograph, but we have these amazing portraits also here, like the Mazziere in front of the Colosseum, with this landscape, with this very particular sfumato, which can be compared, of course, to the background of the Madonna di Monteluce, and may make us reconsider the discussion about Dos or Raphael for that background, and maybe the fresco here may be an argument in favor of the attribution to Raphael of that fresco. Of that background in the Madonna di Foligno. Now, the figure of the St. Peter in the sky, if we think back to the Pandects, or if we think ahead of the Moses in the ceiling of the same room, there's again not much I need to say. Just look at the hand, just look at how the color is applied on the hand of St. Peter's, compare that to the emperor in the Pandects, or compare that to the hand of the Moses, compare how the hand, compare the blue. So it's immediately obvious that that same person is moving around Raphael's workshop, and as I said before, I think that might well be Lorenzo Lotto. But let's stick for a moment with the ceiling in that room, because in 1514 it's a very important moment in Raphael's career. There is a new pope. Bramante dies. The new pope names him architect of St. Peter, and in the top right drawing, you have that famous little sketch for the nave of St. Peter's, where he's beginning to grapple with the new job. But you also have a preliminary sketch for the Moses in front of the burning bush, and that gets that composition on its way, and it can give an indication how Raphael used this workshop, because we have the cartoon in Naples, which we see at the top right. And that cartoon was always considered autographed. There's no reason to doubt that. So what this is telling us is that Raphael is probably controlling his workshop through the drawing, through the cartoon, and then he tells his collaborators how he wants to apply the colors, what color scheme he wants, and that's the moment when he delegates his work. Now, if the attribution to Lorenzo Lotto is right, again, that is an interesting moment, because there is this very beautiful article by Francesco Cortesi Bosco, who has shown that Lorenzo Lotto is using the preparatory drawings precisely for this scene, and also the versos of these sheets, which have nothing to do with the scene in the ceiling of the Stanza della Segnatura. So what it looks like is that Lorenzo Lotto, when Raphael was promoted to the architect to being the architect of St. Peter's, that he thought he could get the job as the court painter of Leo X, and when Raphael retained both positions, he decided there was nothing more for him to do, and he moved to Bergamo. And this is the moment when Raphael is looking for another master, another senior collaborator in his workshop. And again, he's employing someone from Venice. He's turning to Giovanni da Udine, and that is probably the moment when Raphael gets someone he can rely on in a moment when he has many other things to do in terms of architecture, in terms of archaeological research, and in terms of finishing the papal apartment. We've already seen the Loggetta and the Stufetta yesterday. These are the two projects for Cardinal Bibbiena, where generally Giovanni da Udine is mentioned simply because of the motifs, 1515, 1516, the first works that we have of him. And there are some drawings which probably can be attributed to him. I don't want to go into the attribution process yet now, but I just want to show you a drawing that was before owned by Richard Krautheimer, and where this griffin here on the right of that sheet seems to be used in that frieze that runs along the top of the vault of the Stufetta, or that goat in the top left, which is very close in the position to that ram. Again, that turns up in that frieze. And the same applies to the Stufetta, where you have that Sphinx, and again, that jumping animal which comes close to the goat. So here, Raphael seems to have used models from Giovanni da Udine's sketchbook for the decoration, and he may have asked him to apply these various motifs for the decoration of the Bibbiena apartment. Of course, the main achievement where we always think of Giovanni da Udine is the loggia on the second floor, which runs along the papal apartment, where Leo X would go every day to pray, and where major visitors would go through the private audience. Again, here we have lots of grotesque, we have lots of fruit, we have lots of animals. So that was, at least for the decorative part, something that was always connected to the name of Giovanni da Udine. And it is again here that we need to remember Vasari's episode, which he tells us when Raphael and Giovanni da Udine go to the Domus Aurea, to the Golden House of Nero, and they see the antique painting. But Giovanni da Udine is not content by imitating the antique style, the antique motifs, the grotesque. He also wants to get involved technically, so he sits at home, he draws up various recipes to find again the white stucco, and when he finally achieves that, Raphael does not only employ that white plaster for the Loggetta of Cardinal Bibbiena, but he uses these 13 bays, and you just have to imagine what scale that means, something he's never tried out. He doesn't know how it reacts technically. We nowadays in our conservation department have to grapple with that. So that is something that Raphael applies, and that is very typical of his very experimental nature, and that's one of the great successes of Giovanni da Udine. But if we want to get an idea what Giovanni da Udine's role in the workshop was, we have to have a methodological approach. We have to set some standards, we have to find moments, we have to identify works that we can attribute to him with a great certainty, and there, of course, as far as the drawings are concerned, we can rely on his notebook, where we have drawings in it. They're fairly late, they're from the 1550s, but at least they give us an idea, they give us a measure to attribute works to him. And there is, of course, the drawing in Windsor Castle, a very interesting drawing. It's characteristically a quarter of the Volta Dorata in the Golden House of Nero. It is a flattened drawing, so it shows that Giovanni da Udine, whose handwriting we have in this drawing, was perfectly capable of doing an architectural drawing. Vasari tells us that he worked in the Fabbrica di San Pietro with Bramante, so he was familiar with the way that a professional architect would represent something that is of a fairly complex shape. And we see that next to a sketch of a fragment of an antique relief, which after all today is bricked in a wall in Piazza di Spagna in Rome, and I hope you can recognize the dragon on the helmet. So it's precisely that sketch that is the opposite way of recording a monument that we have in this very important sheet for Giovanni da Udine in Windsor Castle. Now, you can put together this oeuvre also with other elements. There is again this drawing for a banner in the notebook. You can make a stylistic comparison, for example, with the drawing in Munich, but the drawing in Munich also has that word ricamato written on it. You know, Giovanni da Udine came from a family that was called De Nani, and because of their business, then they took on the name ricamatori. So whoever attributed that drawing to Giovanni da Udine was very familiar with that name. It's a very old attribution, and you have this very beautiful lunette with Orpheus with the animals at the bottom. And again, I want to draw your attention to that molding that you see above Orpheus's head. He's absolutely familiar with every convention that an architect has to draw something like that. And this is the person that Raphael is employing. His style doesn't change very much till his very old age. In 1556, he designs the bell tower for the church of the Archangel Michael in San Daniele del Friuli. And again, if you just look at this detail of the entablature, you can see how this experience in Bramantes workshop lasted in Raphael's workshop, how Raphael sort of could use these qualities. You have above that capital the breakout, which only applies to the architrave and the frieze, but not to the cornice. This is a very sophisticated detail that Bramante invented in the upper courtyard in the Belvedere. So Giovanni da Udine was very sensitive to these issues, and he was able to represent that in a perfect manner also in an architectural drawing. Now, a couple of years ago, this drawing in Berlin turned up in the Berlin print room with a traditional attribution to Giovanni da Udine, and it also has his handwriting on it. And it makes Vasari's story about the bottom of the Santa Cecilia, which is here in the exhibition, even more credible. You can see how the draftsman is interested in representing all the technical details of the instruments in a precise way to understand everything, how it is constructed, how it is used, to give a professional representation in the painting. Then there is this helmet on the left, which is in the Courtauld Institute in London. Again, the hatching is very similar to the head on the back of the Windsor sheet. The Sphinx can be compared to the Sphinx in the Krautheimer drawing. If you look at the breasts, if you look at the shallow eyes, which also turned up in other motifs in the Krautheimer drawing, like the mouth of the lion. And this is precisely the head that's lying next to the throne of Leo in the Battle of Ostia. And it is not a copy after that fresco because it's lit completely differently. The decoration on that helmet has not been sort of modeled finally as it is then in the executed version in the fresco. The tail of the lion is still differently. So there are still changes to be made, and it is not a copy after the fresco. And since there is this stylistic similarity to the Windsor drawing, I think this is another element where Raphael relies on Giovanni da Udine's models, on details that he designed for his frescoes. Now, the Battle of Ostia is a very eclectic work, a very eclectic fresco. I just remind you of that capital, that Ionic capital, which is the step that leads up to the throne of Leo, and Raphael is simply using, even in the same position, the details that are drawn here. There is a copy in the Fossombroni sketchbook, and he's simply taken over the side view of that capital, and he's made a fragment out of that volute and has hidden it underneath the earth. So that's the way this fresco is composed. The fresco comes at a critical moment in Raphael's career. Here he's got too much work to do with St. Peter's and the archaeological studies, so he's not preparing the drawings himself anymore. He's just giving instructions to his people, to his pupils and to his collaborators, how they should put together the composition, and this is the result you then get. But they have by now adapted the practice as it started in the Santa Cecilia. And the still life you have underneath Leo's throne is the same practice to arrive at an artistic solution also in this fresco here. Now, that helmet, I think, has already been used slightly before for the head of the for the Saul in the conversion of Saul in the tapestries for the Sistine Chapel. It is the same type of the helmet without the feathers at the top that the saint is wearing. And again, I've put the Windsor drawing next to it, so you can get an idea of the stylistic environment that whole detail is coming out of. That is not to say that this wonderful composition is something that was designed by Giovanni da Udine. This is the challenge that Michelangelo faces when he comes to design the conversion of Saul in the Pauline Chapel. There are lots of elements in this fresco which sort of Michelangelo responds to. Of course, we have a completely different figure of the saint who is lying on the ground, imitating a crucified Christ, but we have the tension between the two protagonists that Michelangelo then is taken over, and we have the demonic horse that's here in the back, and that will acquire a prominent position in Michelangelo's fresco. But just note the sword underneath the saint, which again shows you how thrilled they are with these details and how much they play with these details in an otherwise composition that has an otherwise completely different scope. But they get sort of even involved down to that little detail, and this is the kind of thing where Raphael employs Giovanni da Udine for details like this. I'll just briefly mention the drawing that we still don't know where it is, but which John Shearman already pointed to in his publication on the tapestries of these birds. There it seemed just a casual similarity. But again, after looking at the conversion of Saul, I think it was again Raphael quite consciously choosing details for a larger composition from the sketchbook of his collaborators. In the loggia, then, we have this drawing which also bears Giovanni da Udine's handwriting in Edinburgh, and which is probably the prepared drawing for one of the pilasters in the loggia. And Giovanni da Udine was quite capable of designing a whole wall space with his grotesque of organizing a large wall space, as you can see from the back of the Krautheimer drawing, where you have all sorts of things he's trying out in this on this window wall. So Raphael might very well have entrusted to him the decoration of these walls in the stanza. But that was not the only thing that Giovanni da Udine did for him. He also, Raphael also used him as a surveyor of the antiquities. There's a famous horse in Washington, formerly in Chatsworth, which is unanimously attributed to Raphael, but which Raphael gave to Giovanni da Udine, and he sent him off to take the measurements of the colossal horse on the Quirinal. And the drawing was taken off the mount a couple of years ago, and on the back there were actually autograph drawings by Giovanni da Udine with his handwriting, with his measurements, very tectonic way of approaching the sarcophagus, which you see at the bottom at the time in the Savelli collection, but the sketchy base, which again then to which this then again he has added with an architectural convention the detail of the molding at the bottom. And then there is in red chalk again Giovanni da Udine's handwriting on that drawing. Börje Magnusson then went on to attribute to Giovanni da Udine this drawing in Stockholm, again a drawing after the antique, which I think goes very well with the Kingfisher for the loggia in the British Museum. And if you turn that sheet around, you have this marvelous watercolor on the back, which resolves a problem that Pouncey and Gear formulated precisely 50 years ago. This year it's 50 years that their wonderful catalogue in the British Museum came out, and where they first address the problem of the Master of the Birds. And now that we can attribute these drawings to Giovanni da Udine with also the parrots, again, as a subject described by Vasari for Giovanni da Udine, that Master of the Birds can probably be accepted as being Giovanni da Udine. Look at the grasshopper at the bottom, which where it's drawn with the pen, and then above that just with the brush, or the dove that was bought a couple of years ago by the Louvre. I should very briefly consider another problem. This is the drawing of the Jonah. It's a very odd drawing because if you go into the Chigi Chapel in Santa Maria Maggiore, you never get the proper angle from which this statue may have been drawn. You cannot resolve that either with the stucco in the Vatican loggia. The position never works. But there is a second drawing of this in Dresden, which is precisely identical to the drawing in Windsor Castle. If you look at the tail of the here on the right of the dolphin, where the line is interrupted, if you look at the contour over the shoulder, or if you look at the armpit with that little stroke here, which compares in both drawings. And the drawing in Dresden is drawn on oiled paper, so it may well be a tracing of that drawing, but not just drawn by anybody, because it's then reworked with a white heightening. And it may well be a tracing that, for whatever reason, Giovanni da Udine may have, or the draftsman may have done, the same draftsman who did the first drawing. Now, I know I'm provoking some discussion here, and I want to take up a discussion that Silvia Farino has started 30 years ago when she said the drawings by Penny, to whom this one here has been attributed, is not just penny, but it's threepence. So, well, there may be 5 or 6 pence to that. And it's about time that we started to break up the oeuvre that is the famous dustbin, as John Shearman used to call it, and reconsider the attributions of these drawings. I wonder whether there is a chance to attribute the drawing in Dresden precisely to Giovanni da Udine. If you look at the cross-hatching at the back and compare that to the cross-hatching in the Windsor head, if you look at the black dotted eye that you're having and that returns in the head in the Dresden drawing, that and the again the hatching on the legs in the Windsor drawing, again the black dotted eyes, comparing that to the Edinburgh drawing may actually stimulate the discussion on how you construct the oeuvre of Giovanni da Udine, based or relying or sort of taking over a certain group from these from these penny drawings. It may even lead to the discovery of some panel painting. Then, if you think of the drawing of the painting in the Louvre, based on that drawing you see here on the right. Now, in conclusion, I've not talked. Sorry, this is another question which is here in the exhibition, and of course we need to ask ourselves which role a drawing like this does have in the designing process. Of course, it has a completely different shape from the picture. It's very, you know, when I look at this in the exhibition, I don't really understand what the relationship between the drawing and the picture is. And again, there may be more work needed on the attribution and in identifying the role of the drawing in the design process. We don't know who Penny is, and I'm very much looking forward to the talk this afternoon on Giovanni Francesco Penny. Now, in this talk, I've left out a number of issues. I haven't talked about the Giochi di Putti. We yesterday saw the wonderful tapestry, and we know that Giovanni da Udine has been using them in the Villa Madama and then in a late work in the castle in Udine. But, you know, if you look here on the left, at the part next to the coat of arms of Leo X in the first loggia of the Vatican, you have these putti there. You see that Giovanni da Udine is doing much more than just drawing groteschi and animals. That is the loggia that he painted immediately after the second loggia between 1519 and before the death of Leo in 1521, where he becomes an artist in his own right and does a completely independent work, where you have the birds at the top we've seen in these watercolors, and where he may even react to famous works like Leonardo's Sala delle Asse in Milan he may have heard of. I've not talked about the garden loggia in Villa Madama. Cheryl Rees yesterday showed us an image of that. I've not talked about the Sala dei Pontefici, which Lorraine Carafel mentioned. It's too complicated in a talk like that to get involved with the Sala dei Palafrenieri, and I did not go into the Farnesina either. So all works where Giovanni da Udine, around the death of Raphael or slightly before, has been involved in. We don't know about his red chalk drawings. There are his wash drawings, his easel paintings, and maybe sort of pursuing the research with the things that I have presented. We may actually get some further there. Anyway, the first loggia with these fired wheels by Raphael show an artist that has his capacities when he's left on his own. It is, of course, quite indicative of what he is showing. What he then perceives as his task, something that he is doing. For example, there are no figurative scenes in these walls here. When Giovanni da Udine started in Venice and was so eager to get into the Raphael workshop, when he went to Domenico Grimani to get his presentation letter and to go to Baldassare Castiglione because he knew he was a friend of Raphael's, I wonder whether he knew what he was letting himself into. But because he was going to a master who had defined his own line of beauty 2 centuries before Hogarth. He had perceived the light just in a hilt of a sword. He had perceived the light to the utmost abstraction and lived to the minimum of impression. Again, we're used to seeing parts of painting like that centuries later. He's transcended even the divine light, just the arm of St. Peter behind the fist of the angel divided by these rays. Nevertheless, Giovanni da Udine was not scared by these works, but he became the hinge of Raphael's workshop. He ran it. He designed large schemes for the master. He contributed details. He provided small drawings of animals and fruits, as we always have thought. He surveyed the monuments. He provided architectural competence. Yesterday we also heard of the Palazzo Brancogno dell'Aquila. So he was quite an all-rounder in that workshop. And you can run workshops in quite different ways. Like Perugino, very strict, so you can't really distinguish the various parts. You can run it very loose, like Pinturicchio, where he lays everybody to do what he wants to. You can make it a joint venture, like the Quattrocento frescoes in the Sistine Chapel. You can not work with a workshop at all, being completely incapable of having collaborators like Michelangelo. Or you can lead it with an undisputed authority, with a strong personality, where you even have the freedom to accept the inspiration from the collaborators, as Raphael did, not only from Giovanni da Udine. And you can then also enjoy what these collaborators produce. Again, this is a very charming passage in Vasari, where he talks about the trastullo di Raffaello, a pastime and a relaxation that Giovanni da Udine was for Raphael, and again, walking underneath the first loggia, something of that is still alive today in the Vatican. Thank you very much.